Welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I delve into the life, conquests, character, and legacy of Amir Timur. So let's just dive straight right into this, shall we? We last left Amir Timur after successfully defeating the Sufi dynasty, his northwestern neighbors in Khwarezmia, before arranging the wedding between his son Jahangir and the princess Khanzada. Now, it is important to remember that when talking about Timur's campaigns, especially in these early years, invasion does not always equal conquest. So Timur had temporarily defeated the men of Khwarezmia, but most of that realm was not under Timur's control at this point. My favorite historian on the subject, and probably the best Timurid historian, Beatrice Manns, sums this up with this. Timur's campaigns against them, that is, his immediate neighbors in the early days of his reign, Timur's campaigns against them, these campaigns were not designed for conquest, but as an assertion of superior power and an indication to neighboring states that Timur would tolerate no threats to his power. So these were power moves to extinguish or diminish threats, protect his position as Emir of Transoxiana, and then of course the spoils of war were always a welcome aspect too. Thus, Khwarezmia had not been destroyed. Defeated, yes, but Yusuf Sufi was still alive, and, well, his capital city of Urgench was still standing and his army still strong. And, as you can probably expect, we will be hearing from them again in the future. But as we've discussed before, Khwarezmia was not Timur's only neighbor. To his northeastern borders was the realm of Moghulistan. If you'll remember back, Timur's history with Moghulistan was always very complicated and intertwined. For Transoxiana and Moghulistan were the two primary pieces of what had once been the great Chagatai Khanate. Thus, discord and war between the two lands was very common, as rulers of both desired to conquer the other and perhaps bring back to life the glorious Khanate. And this is now where we find Amir Timur, in the early days of 1374. He had fought Moghulistan before, but like Khwarezmia, had not decisively defeated them. Thus, maybe it was time to strike back. And on top of that, like we've covered 1,000 times already, the longer Timur sits and does nothing, the more likely his subjects and the tribes will rise up against him. Keeping the wars going keeps his economy going, his warriors happy, and himself alive. At least, that's the goal. Thus, in March of 1374, Timur called the army together and prepared for his second invasion of Moghulistan. Or third invasion, or possibly even fourth. So, when we covered his first actual invasion so many months ago, I mentioned how that there's this debate on just how many times Timur invaded Moghulistan, when he invaded, and what even constitutes an invasion. And for reasons I discussed in the past, I've decided to lump his first and second invasions of Moghulistan into just his first invasion. Thus, I am calling this invasion, the one we're talking about today in 1374, as his true second invasion. But just be aware that some authors will call this his third, and, well, they're not wrong. It's just kind of a debate of definitions. But anyway, it is mid-March of 1374 now, and a few weeks have transpired since I was talking about that. But the horsemen and the soldiers of Transoxiana are moving east. And trouble falls on Timur almost immediately. First of all, Qamar-ud-din Dughlat, the ruler of Moghulistan, is nowhere to be found. Neither are any of his armies. Timur is marching into Moghulistan seemingly unopposed, and while that might sound nice, it leaves everybody uneasy. When will the Moghuls be found? Where are they? Are we walking into a trap? But the second and much larger issue is something that the Swedes or the French or the Germans could tell you a thing or two about. The steppe of Eurasia can get cold. Very cold. So if you'll remember back, Moghulistan today would have incorporated much of Kyrgyzstan, parts of the westernmost regions of China, and eastern Uzbekistan. Much of this land was steppe grasslands, but then you also have the Tian Shan Mountains in the south. And with these mountains comes an abundance of rainstorms, sleet, and snow during the winter months. Now, it is mid-March, but spring generally doesn't begin in these parts until April or sometimes even May. I checked what weather in Kyrgyzstan is in March today, or I should say these years, and on average the temperature is negative 5 degrees Celsius or 23 degrees Fahrenheit. And storms, snow, and rain are very common. And this is the weather that Timur is marching straight into. We're told that this was a particularly harsh end of winter, and perhaps Timur did not expect the mountains to affect the climate so much, but here he was. An entire army of men and horses and pack animals marching east, uneasy about the lack of any enemy, bundled in any clothing or furs they could gather, shivering and trying to shield themselves from the relentless wind and snow and rain and ice. The rain is pounding down upon them, rolling into every crevice of their armor or their clothes and equipment, and then the rain freezes. Men start falling, the horses are slipping, and after a few days of this, the death toll starts to skyrocket. Every day brings a new list of men who froze to death. But suffering more than the men were the horses, who started to die in droves, we're told. In fact, so many horses died that Timur realized that even if his army survived and found the enemy, his military capacities would be devastated because he'd have an army of horsemen with no horses. It's interesting to note, if you'll remember way back, that there was a time when the Moghuls were laying siege to Samarkand. This was before Timur was Amir. And what saved the city was, a stout defense put up by the people, but also a plague wiped out the Moghul horses. And these steppe armies are inseparable from their horses. Their power and excellence as warriors comes from their relationship and mastery of their mounts. So, like the Moghuls before him, Timur decided that his only logical option was to return back home and wait for winter to finish. Historical writer Hilda Hookham suggests that so many horses were lost or sick that the men had to leave any sick horses behind, and most of the soldiers had to walk home. But they did make it to Transoxiana and settled down to wait for spring to come. But, wait a minute, do you hear that? There are whispers among the tribes, and these whispers are not too happy with Timur's recent actions. Timur had just led the army to disaster. Sure, the army was still mostly intact, and there were plenty of horses back home to replace those lost, but how long would it be before a disaster like this would befall the followers of Timur, and there would be no way out, no second chance? Again, for every mistake that Timur makes, for every day he sits still, discord grows. Thus, as soon as the last of the snow had melted, it was probably in May of 1374, about 2 months later, Timur regathered the tribal warriors and marched east again. Time was against him, and he knew that he needed to show his men success as soon as possible. The army crossed into the lands of Moghulistan for a second time, but again there was no opposition. Qamar-ud-din and the Moghul army were nowhere to be found. So uneasiness begins to set in among the troops again. This wasn't normal. But still, Timur pushed them on. Now, the size and the strength of medieval armies is always near impossible to estimate. Authors of this time often wrote about events decades or even centuries after it happened. They maybe had no real way to verify the numbers or simply just loved to exaggerate. There are exceptions to this, of course, but at this point in Timur's story, we run into the same issue. There was no historian or author at this point with Timur whose works have survived. So, as for the amount of soldiers that Timur had with him now, one source says a few hundred, while another source goes as far to say that he had well over 30,000. Looking back, it was probably somewhere in between those two estimates, probably towards the middle, maybe leaning towards the top. But regardless, this was a large army, with baggage trains and followers and slaves as well. As such, like any sizable army, Timur had a vanguard force leading the way and scouting a good ways ahead of the main army. Timur remained with the main force. He had to make sure to keep an eye on everybody there. But his son, the young Prince Jahangir, who we met last episode, was far ahead commanding the vanguard, searching for Qamar-ud-din and the rest of the Moghuls. Anyway, after several days of continuing east, some of the scouts captured a man and brought him to Timur. One of our sources, written by Muhammad Haidar, tells us that this man was a Mughal soldier, possibly a scout, possibly an officer, but probably somebody who had some information. The man was brought to Timur and told, or maybe forced, to tell everything that he knew. The prisoner told Timur's war council that Qamar-ud-din was currently at a place called the Blue Hill, and he was here gathering the Mughal tribes to his army, but likely had no idea that Timur's army was as close as they were. Thus, Timur decided to act as quickly as possible in order to try and catch Qamar-ud-din off guard or before he was at full strength. Timur sent messengers to his son Jahangir, commanding him to advance with the vanguard as quickly as possible towards the Blue Hill location, and that Timur would be following with the rest of the army as fast as they could behind. And so, hearing this, Jahangir saddled his horse and rode out with the vanguard as fast as they could. Soon thereafter, Jahangir and the vanguard arrived at the Blue Hill location but found Qamar-ud-din's army retreating. Maybe Mughal scouts had seen what was happening, maybe Qamar-ud-din actually saw Jahangir's men approaching, but either way, the element of surprise was gone. The Mughals knew that Jahangir was there, and surely Timur was soon to follow. Thus, they decided to retreat to a more defensible position. This was now a chase. Qamar-ud-din decided to head straight into the Tian Shan Mountains, hoping to fortify the high ground against Jahangir and then against Timur. We're told that the Mughals hastily climbed the outlying parts of the mountain range, crossed 3 ravines and several rivers until they decided to hold near the 3rd ravine. And during this whole evacuation or pullback operation, Jahangir was in hot pursuit. We're not given the details here, but I would imagine that any stragglers from the Mughal army were cut down or shot with arrows as the vanguard raced forward, and Qamar-ud-din urging his men forward to the defensible position where they could hold. So finally the Mughals reached that position, and Qamar-ud-din immediately told them to start digging trenches, putting up the barricades, count your arrows, sharpen your spears and swords, because this is where we will hold. Jahangir was right behind them, but decided to wait on attacking. The day was almost over, and his men needed to rest from the pursuit. And so Jahangir and the vanguard camped that night, while just a short distance away from the Mughals. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in Jahangir's shoes, I would send messengers back to Timur, tell him where Qamar-ud-din is, and then wait for, quite literally, the cavalry to arrive. The Mughals almost certainly outnumber your vanguard unit, probably by a lot. They're in a defensible position in the mountains, probably uphill. You're probably going to have to engage them on foot rather on horseback, and those don't look like good odds at all. In fact, it would probably be foolish to attack the Mughals instead of waiting. Oh, there he goes, he's attacking. Yeah, this is Jahangir we're talking about here, the son of Amir Timur, and he is his father's son. Why wait when you can attack? So the very next morning, Jahangir and his vanguard attacked the Mughal position right away. And these vanguard soldiers were very likely the best of Timur's army. The vanguard is a very important but also very dangerous part of an advancing army. Thus, you typically want to make sure it's the best guys possible. So these were men who had probably been with Timur for a while, maybe going all the way back to his mercenary years, but almost certainly veterans from his early campaigns against the Khwarezmians or the Mughals before. These men were professional warriors. But why should I tell you what happened next when Yazdi writes this? But the Prince Jahangir, having an army composed of men who understood the art of war, resolutely marched at their position, and at the sound of the kettle drums, attacked. We're told that as Jahangir and the vanguard advanced, they first rained down arrows upon the Mughal position. And when I say rain down arrows, I mean just that. I know we haven't talked too much about the actual composition of Timur's army, the individual units or soldiers, the armor, weapons, etc. Don't worry, we will spend a ton of time doing that in the future, probably several episodes. But for now, I just want to say this. Mongolian, Turkish steppe warfare at this point, it was mostly reliant on archery, particularly horse archery, as we've talked about. And these guys were crazy with just how deadly they were with a bow. A well-practiced horse archer, armed with the Mongolian or Turkish-style compound bow, They could shoot about 12 arrows a minute. Their range could reach up to 160 meters. They were deadly accurate. And, remember that oftentimes their horses are galloping at up to 40 miles per hour or so while they're doing this. This is insanity. And it's kind of hard to picture just how this looked or played out, but thankfully we have incredible videos of people reenacting this art of fighting today, and it truly is an art form. I'll try and remember to post some videos of it on Twitter or Facebook or something. And again, we'll definitely talk more about this in the future, but I wanted to reiterate this because a rain of arrows is really a rain of arrows. It's definitely a real thing when steppe archers were in the picture. Thus, Jahangir and his men rained arrows upon the Moguls, as the Moguls were shocked that they would actually be attacked here. They had the advantage after all, but the drums are sounding and the arrows are falling, and the Mughal soldiers were rushing to cover or trying to return fire while surrounded by their comrades falling down around them. Now, I'm actually going to pause the battle for a second. I know that's kind of cruel of me, but we need to talk about a grisly reality about combat. If you might be disturbed about talking about violence and the suffering in actual fighting, you might want to skip a few minutes ahead. But here's the deal. Hollywood, video games, and other media do a terrible job at accurately showing ancient, medieval, or really any type of historical combat. And I'm not saying this as somebody who has been in combat, thankfully, but if you read anything that any soldier has ever written or told, you'll know what I'm talking about. And that's this. Arrows don't kill people. The purpose of an arrow is not to kill people, but to incapacitate them. The human body is incredibly resilient, and in most cases, being shot by an arrow, unless it's directly in the head, neck, or heart, it's not going to instantly kill you. Sure, you may bleed out pretty fast, but it's not this instant death projectile that Hollywood shows all the time. Guys are hit by arrow fire and they fall over immediately dead. That's not how this usually worked. And the same actually goes for bullets, although definitely to a lesser degree. I remember when I was a kid, I first realized this, and I grew up on those glorified and very clean Hollywood movies where being shot meant instant death. You know what I'm talking about. But then I read the book Black Hawk Down by Mark Bowden, which is about the 1993 American military raid on Mogadishu and Somalia. And the book has a lot of first-hand combat interviews from the American soldiers who were actually there. But I remember one soldier saying that he was using a smaller caliber of bullet than he should have been using for his rifle, and while shooting at an enemy, these bullets just passed right through him. And this man continued to fight on even after being hit many, many times. And that was one of those first wake-up calls I had about how actual combat actually is so different than what is often portrayed. Now, going back to arrows, there are many accounts of soldiers surviving arrow wounds and either continuing to fight or living on. In fact, there's one historical writer named Jean de Joinville who fought during the Seventh Crusade, and he wrote about his experiences, including the time where he was in a battle where he was shot 7 times with arrows, but lived to tell the tale. Thus, to continue this disturbing conversation, battle was horrifying. And probably the loudest thing on a battlefield was not the clashing of weapons or the braying of horses, but the sounds of the anguished screams of the men and the animals who were slowly dying. And after these medieval or ancient battles, there was almost always a final stage where the victors went around and killed the hundreds or thousands of enemy soldiers who were still alive on the battlefield. Anyway, why do I bring this up? Well, I've noticed that a lot of modern media sterilizes or even glorifies how combat or battle is portrayed. And I'm not trying to say that I'm above that or whatever. Trust me, as a good American growing up, I ate that narrative up for a long time. But war is horrific. It was horrific, it is horrific, and it will forever be horrific. And that is how, I believe, war should be described as. And the wars of Timur are no different. Anyway, with that, returning to the battle, Jahangir's men loosed hundreds of arrows upon the Moguls, who were caught in the rain of missiles and thrown into disarray. And then these volleys were followed by the vanguard raising their voices in war cries, pulling out the swords and the spears and the maces, and charging up into the trenches in the ranks of the Moguls. But the Moguls were not defeated. They had brave and experienced veterans as well. So the two forces met, climbing over the dirt and the ramparts and their fallen comrades, each side trying to drive the other one to a rout, each man struggling against another. Hour after hour passed, exhaustion set in, but still they fought on, with the young prince Jahangir urging his soldiers forward with encouragement and commands. But eventually, both sides had to disengage, with the battle being a draw, because the day was over. They had literally fought all day, and night was approaching. Oh, and as another quick note about how medieval warfare is portrayed in Hollywood and other media, night battles almost never happened. Sure, there are a few rare cases, but 9 times out of 10, I'd even say 99 times out of 100, armies would disengage and wait for the morning should the battle go until nightfall. And there's a very simple reason for this. People can't see at night. Anyway, the next morning, Jahangir's camp awakens and they prepare for another day of fighting. They gather their equipment and their weapons, and they get ready. And the attack begins. But there's nobody there. Only the dead and the dying remain. The Mughal army has vanished. So it turns out that Qamar-ud-din had decided to flee further into the mountains because he had lost so many men to the battle, but even worse, many of his men and tribes were beginning to desert him. You see, it's the same problem that Timur or any tribal leader at this time has. You have to keep your tribes happy. Thus, Jahangir saw that this was happening and immediately sent word to Timur and began his pursuit again. Timur hears of this and tells his son, "Go, press forward as fast and as aggressively as possible. We have to defeat, or even better, capture or kill Qamar-ud-din." Now, we're told this was about 53 days into the invasion, and Qamar-ud-din had survived, but his army was fracturing, and his realm was thrown into confusion as nobody knew what the Mughal army or the leadership was even doing, where they were they still even alive, what is going on? And in this chaos, Jahangir's men continued forward, harassing any Mughal troops they came upon and sacking the towns and villages in their way as well. And in Jahangir's wake, Timur and the army were doing the same thing, destroying and looting the countryside as they marched. Now, somewhere along this journey, Jahangir was able to gain a huge victory against the Mughals, albeit not a military victory. In his haste to retreat, Qamar-ud-din was forced to leave behind his family, including his wife, a woman named Buyan Aga, as well as his daughter named Dilshad Aga. These women were captured by Jahangir, and Jahangir immediately sent word to his father. This was a huge political victory and kind of marks the end of Timur's second invasion of Moghulistan. Much of the region had been ravaged, many Mughal soldiers had been killed, hundreds of people were enslaved and sent back to Samarkand, and Qamar-ud-din's own family had been captured. Still, though, Qamar-ud-din had escaped Timur's grasp. And although I do not like quoting from Timur's alleged autobiography, I will admit that it has a great quote here, where it tells us that Timur, speaking about Qamar-ud-din, said, "Although we have quenched the fire, we have left the sparks." And as that foreshadowing says, the story of Qamar-ud-din and the Mughals is far from over. But for now, a victory was a victory. Timur's forces reunited with Jahangir's, and Timur praised his son for his brilliant actions during the campaign. Jahangir, in return, kissed his father's feet and then brought forth the treasures and the prisoners to be given to the Amir, including the wife and daughter of Qamar-ud-din. With the Mughal forces in flight, Timur ordered that the army begin a victory celebration. Feasts, concerts, music, and all sorts of other celebrations were organized and begun. And in the heart of Moghulistan, Timur rewarded his loyal soldiers and officers as well as his beloved son Jahangir. And then, with these celebrations, a wedding was organized as well. For reasons we discussed last episode, Timur married Dilshad Aga, Qamar-ud-din's captured daughter. Any opportunity to humiliate Timur's enemies had to be taken, and that ends Timur's second invasion of Moghulistan. But even during victory and celebration, there were problems to be had. Several of some of the most powerful men in Timur's army were conspiring to kill him. Mehmed Bayan Soldus of the powerful Sudus tribe and commander of some of Timur's own personal bodyguards, along with Adil Shah, a leader in the Jalayir tribe, and a few other prominent men, they made a pact to assassinate Timur during the middle of the wedding and the celebrations. Perhaps they feared his growing power, perhaps they were unhappy with the rewards they had been given from the campaign, we don't know. But given the politics of the steppe, it's not surprising that such a conspiracy arose. But somehow, Timur became aware that the conspiracy had been hatched. Again, we don't know how Timur learned of this, but Yazdi does give us 4 possibilities. A co-conspirator may have secretly warned the emir. The actions of the conspirators themselves may have given something away. Maybe God was protecting Timur, or maybe it was just good fortune. Regardless, though, Timur found out. And he immediately recognized the danger he was in. How far did this conspiracy go? How much of the army was secretly against him? Were the Moghuls involved? Who could he trust? Thus, Timur immediately gathered his sons, his family, and only the closest officers and veterans he knew he could trust, and immediately headed back to his capital of Samarkand, leaving the entire army behind. He sent word back, of course, telling the men to return to their homes and pastures and harvests. The campaign was over, and the army did just that. And the conspirators were at a total loss. They had been outplayed by Timur, albeit momentarily. And so, with the men of Transoxiana back in their homes, months passed as the army disbanded and returned to their herds or their farms or their other occupations. And while Timur remained in his capital, the conspirators decided to bide their time and wait. But not all of them were as confident in the situation. Adil Shah, a prominent leader in the Jalayir tribe and one of the men who had plotted to kill Timur, decided that doing so was a terrible mistake. So he sent word to Timur admitting to the entire plot, telling Timur of the other conspirators, and begging Timur for his forgiveness. Timur received the information and sent a message back to Adil Shah. And you can just imagine the terror in this man's stomach as he heard the messenger was back with words from the emir. And then maybe this terror turned into confusion as Adil Shah heard the message. In it, Timur praised Adil Shah for his loyalty, praised him for his past deeds in war, praised him for being such a man of valor and wisdom, and then forgave him for all of his transgressions. And with the message came gifts. No soldiers, no assassins, nothing, just forgiveness. Summer turned to autumn and then passed into winter as well, and it's now the spring of 1375, and the cycle of war lurched into its next stage. Timur commanded the tribes and the armies to gather at Samarkand and prepare for the next seasonal campaigns. And with the commands, the warriors gathered. Tribal contingents arrived one by one, and finally everybody was gathered waiting for Timur's direction. But Timur had more than just conquest planned. Now that he knew the scope of the conspiracy and those who were guilty, and knowing that it would be impossible to start some sort of grand coup with everybody present, soldiers were dispatched for the conspirators. Plotting against Timur would always have its consequences, and this would be no different. Mehmed Bayan Soldus and the other men were captured and brought before Timur, and the rest of the tribal leaders and the elders and the holy men. A trial was held in which the crimes of betrayal and plotting to kill the emir were brought against the men, and they were all found guilty, the sentence being death. The men were handed over to their own tribal rivals, men who wanted their positions or who had been wronged by them, and then were told that all the conspirators were slaughtered by the sword. They were replaced by rivals and others who pledged their loyalties to Timur. He knew the tribes, and having an enemy in a tribe always meant that there was a potential new ally as well. The only man who was spared was Adil Shah of the Jalayir tribe, the man who had repented and warned Timur earlier. Now, he may not have been here in Samarkand in the first place. He might never have come, fearing that Timur would go back on his word, or perhaps Adil Shah had heard what had befallen the other conspirators and decided to remain home. Whatever the case, Adil Shah lived, but like Qamar-ud-din of the Moghuls, he has not exited our story just yet. We'll be hearing from him again soon. But for now, the conspiracy was squashed and the plotters were dead. The Moghuls had been dealt a stinging defeat and their country was in ruins. For the moment, Timur was secure. But the Amir was not one to sit around. It is now the beginning of 1375, and a new year brings new opportunities to be had. The kettle drums of war were beat, the men supplied, and the army of Amir Timur again prepared to march to war. This has been the Timur Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and also thank you so much for this wave of positive support I got after releasing my last episode. That was just utterly encouraging. So thank you for not giving up on me or on this podcast. We're back. As always, feel free to reach out to me at any time or any reason at timurpodcast@gmail.com or under Timur Podcast on Twitter or Facebook. I still haven't caught up with all of the messages that you've sent me, but I am working on it, so thank you for your patience. But with that, I will see you again soon on the step as we see what the great Amir has planned next right here on the Timur Podcast.